So last time we talked about why anybody would think it's true that all philosophical statements are analytic. Remember that why that's important. It's important because we were starting with this bold idea that philosophy just is the analysis of language. And if we start with the claim that philosophical statements are analytic, we can sort of get to the conclusion that philosophy just is the analysis of language. So we talked about why anybody would think that philosophical statements are analytic. In this segment, we're going to talk about this. Why I think philosophical problems are misunderstandings of language. So remember why that's important, because if we start with the claim that philosophical statements are just misunderstandings of language, we can get to the conclusion that philosophy just is the analysis of language. So let's consider why anybody would think that philosophical problems are misunderstandings of language. And in order to do that, we need to talk about philosophy and surface grammar. So let's look at that. So let's look at some examples here. We're not going to do an argument here. We're just going to look at some examples. So let's take the mind-body problem. Suppose someone says, I have pain, or I am in pain, or something like that. It's natural to hear that, given the grammar of the sentence, and think that pain is something that you have. It's an object that you have. It's something that it's like, like I have a blue coat. I have a pain. If you have a blue coat, the blue coat is an object that you have. If you have a pain, the pain is an object that you have. And that raises a question. Once you say pain is an object that you have, you can ask, what kind of object is it? And you might more specifically ask, is the object, the pain, the same as the object, the brain? And now you have the mind-body problem. How does pain, that thing, relate to other things in the world, like your brain? Well, here's a possible solution to this problem. You can say, look, I have a pain acts like it asserts a proposition. That is, the sentence I have a pain acts like a declarative sentence. A declarative sentence says something about the world. It declares something. It contrasts with interrogative sentences, which ask questions, imperative sentences, which say things like shut the door. They tell you to do something. And other kinds of sentences. There's a wide variety of kinds of sentences. Declarative sentences are the ones that declare something. They say something about the world. A lot of ordinary sentences are declarative sentences. And I have a pain looks like it's among them, like it's a declarative sentence. But suppose that surface grammar is misleading, that it really doesn't declare anything. Instead, it's sort of expressing an emotion. It's like saying, ow. So suppose that the same statement, I have a pain, is really just a fancy way of saying, ouch. Well, ow doesn't suggest that pain is an object. If I say to you, I have a pain, it makes sense if you say, oh, so pain is a thing you have. But if I say, ow, it doesn't make sense for you to say, oh, so pain is a thing you have, right? That doesn't seem to follow in the same way. So it looks like the problem is dissolved. We no longer have reason to think that pain is an object that you have, so we no longer have reason to ask, is that object the same as the object which is the brain? Now, you might think that there are totally independent reasons to think that pain is an object that you have, or that it's a property of an object or something like this. So you might think this isn't much help. But if you really do think that the reason we end up thinking of pain as a kind of thing is because the surface grammar of statements such as I have a pain leads us sort of down a bad path to thinking that, then this looks like it would solve the mind-body problem. Let's look at another example. Suppose someone says murder is bad. This suggests that badness is a property of actions, right? Murder is bad is like saying my jacket is blue, right? That suggests that blueness is a property that my jacket has. Murder is bad suggests that badness is a property that murder has. This raises a question. How does that property, the property of badness, relate to actions? And more generally, how does that property, the property of badness, relate to the material world? Is it identical with some actions or identical with some feature of the material world? Is it necessarily a feature of certain actions such that any action like that is always bad? Or is it really contingently a feature of certain actions? If you fix all the physical facts about our world, have you fixed all of the moral facts? Or are the moral facts somehow independent of the physical facts? This is a basic problem of thinking about morality. Basic problem of what's sometimes called metaethics. Well, suppose you think that murder is bad is just like saying boo murder. So when someone says murder is bad, what they mean is something like boo, and they're doing it at murder. Well, boo murder, unlike the statement murder is bad, which suggests that badness is a property that murder has, boo murder doesn't suggest that murder is a property. So the idea is the surface grammar of this statement is misleading. It doesn't really express what you're trying. There isn't a proposition, murder is bad, that one expresses with this. Instead, one just expresses an attitude. And an attitude doesn't suggest that murder is a property. So the problem is solved. Here's another problem. Problem of a priori knowledge. So I say sisters are siblings, and you ask, how do you know that? And I say, well, it's a priori. And you say, how can you have knowledge without looking? That seems like a reasonable question. That is without experience. Well, here's a solution. Suppose sisters are siblings has the form of an ordinary claim about the world. But in fact, it isn't about the world at all. It's just about language. It seems to describe the world. It seems to say something about sisters. Specifically, it seems to say they all have the property of being siblings. But really, it doesn't say anything about sisters. It just expresses a rule for using language. It's like equivalent to saying this, that part of the meaning of the word sister is that sisters are siblings or something like this. Well, if that's right, then your a priori knowledge isn't really problematic. It's not that you have some knowledge of the way the world is independent of experience. Instead, it's like you can identify rules for using language independent of experience. And remember, when we say independent of experience, we mean independent of the experiences required to acquire the words at issue. Well, if you think of if you think of sisters or siblings as expressing a rule for using language, then of course you can identify that sisters are siblings without any experience beyond that which is required to acquire that rule for using language. Okay, so let's just go back through the flow here. We have this unifying idea for analytic philosophy, which is that philosophy just is the analysis of language. We then say, why would anybody think that's true? One answer is that philosophical statements are analytic. And the idea is if philosophical statements are analytic, then it makes sense that philosophy just is the analysis of language. Another idea is that philosophical problems are misunderstandings of language. And the idea is that if that's right, then it makes sense that philosophy just is the analysis of language. Or you could combine these two in some interesting way. Now, this raises two questions. One, why think philosophical statements are analytic? We answered that question in the last segment on philosophy and analyticity. Another question is, why think philosophical problems are misunderstandings of language? We answered that question in the section on philosophy and surface grammar that we just went through. Okay, so we're going to stop there, and next time we'll talk about some analytic philosophers.